Now, when it comes to our English translations, we have the word-for-word translations. Then we have the thought-for-thought translation. Then we have the paraphrase. The first translation of the Hebrew Bible was the Greek version of the Old Testament called Septuagint. Septuagint included the Old Testament books and Apocrypha, and it was prepared for the diaspora, which was the Jewish people who were living outside of Judea. It was the Greek-speaking Jewish community. Initially, they started with the Torah, and then later different books of the Old Testament were translated and added to the book. It was translated by 70 or 72 scholars. Now, the translation was made in Alexandria, Egypt, which was the center of Hellenistic Judaism. This was the first biblical translation during the time of the Second Temple period. And so the Masoretic manuscripts were used to put together the Hebrew Bible. Later, when Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, they've used their manuscripts to compare with the original manuscripts. Now, Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 by a Bedouin or shepherd who was looking for his goat. Now, it was found in a cave close to the Dead Sea. Dead Sea Scrolls were ancient Hebrew manuscripts. And later they would discover different caves where more manuscripts were found. About 900 scrolls altogether, and 215 of them were biblical scrolls. For example, they've discovered the entire book of Isaiah. They found manuscripts that covered every book except the book of Esther. And these manuscripts were predating the available manuscripts by about 1,000 years. And so this was a remarkable find. Now, the Old Testament is mostly written in Hebrew. Limit writing was done in Aramaic. Like, for example, in Daniel chapter 2 through Daniel chapter 7, it's in Aramaic. And then in Ezra, and then one verse in Jeremiah. Now, the Aramaic language that was used was diplomatic, it was academic level. Also in the New Testament, there are several instances where the Aramaic language is used, like Jesus and him on the cross. Now, Aramaic was considered lingua franca, which was a working or connecting language among various cultures and languages. Like, for example, if you are from Italy and you travel to Scandinavia, you speak Italian, they speak Swedish. Well, you don't speak Swedish, they don't speak Italian. So what is that one language that would connect you? Well, today it would be English. And so that's what Aramaic was back then. Now, as for the New Testament, it was written in Koine Greek, or the common folks Greek language. Today we have over 5,800 known Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Some were discovered earlier, some later. Now, those who were discovered later happen to be older manuscripts. One of the manuscripts that was used to translate the New Testament is called Textus Receptus, or received text. It was the Byzantine manuscripts. Now, the New King James Version, for example, was translated from those manuscripts. Then we had the Alexandrian Text, or the critical text. The New International Version and the New Living Translation was used for that. Then we had the majority text manuscripts. It's simply a consensus of the best Greek manuscripts available to us today. Now, what is interesting about the different manuscripts that were used to translate different versions of the Bible is that 85% of all the manuscripts, the Textus Receptus and the critical text and the majority text, are the same. Now, when it comes to our English translations, we have the word-for-word translations, which is as literal translation as possible. That will be King James Version, New King James Version. Then we have the thought-for-thought translation. It expresses the original meaning in today's language. That will be NIV, New Living Translation. Then we have the paraphrase, which is simplifying the original thought. It's more like a commentary. A good example would be the Message Bible. Now, the first translation of the Greek New Testament was into the Latin language, the Vulgate. Now, in Latin language, it is Biblia Vulgata, which means Bible in common tongue. It was translated in the late 4th century AD by Saint Jerome. He was a priest and he was a Bible translator. Now, this was developed for the church needs, not so much for common folks. Originally, it was translated from the Greek language, but then it was corrected against the Hebrew language. Now, the Latin Vulgate was initially used for the translation of the older English Bibles. Now here's a little timeline of the Bible books and also when they were translated. Now the book of Job is considered to be the earliest book written by some scholars. But 1400 BC, the Ten Commandments were written, and we know from the Bible this was written with the finger of God. And about 400 years before Jesus was born, the Old Testament was completed. And so for 400 years, there was a prophetic silence. The last message written by the prophet Malachi. And finally, at 100 AD, the Bible was completed. Then 300 years later, about 400 AD, the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, was completed. In 1382, Wycliffe's handwritten English translation of the Bible of the Old and New Testament, including the Apocrypha, was completed. Now, this Bible was translated from the Latin Vulgate, written in Old English. Now, here's an example. In John 3:16, it says, God loved so the world that He gave His own begotten Son, that each man that believe in Him perish not, but have everlasting life. Well, we are not used to this kind of English language anymore. That in 1455, Gutenberg's Bible was printed on movable type. Then in 1522, Martin Luther translated the New Testament, and 10 years later, he completed the whole book. In 1525, Tyndale translated the New Testament Bible from the Greek manuscript, and it was printed on the printing press. Then in 1604, the translation of the English Bible was commissioned by King James, and finally in 1611, the King James Version Bible was published. And as we like to say, the rest is history. Now, I'd like to make additional helpful points when it comes to the Bible. When you look at the Bible, you will see either middle column, you'll see footnotes on the bottom, and it will use abbreviations like DSS. Well, that stands for Dead Sea Scrolls. Or you will see GR, which stands for Greek, or HEB, which stands for Hebrew, LAT stands for Latin, LXX stands for Septuagint, that's the Greek Old Testament, M stands for Majority Text, MS or MSS stands for manuscripts or manuscripts. MT stands for Masoretic text, and U stands for critical text. Like for example, in my Bible, I will have a footnote and it will say NU, and so it will show the textual variant where the manuscripts vary from one to the other. Then you have TR, which stands for Textus Receptus or received text, and then finally VG, which stands for Vulgate. Now I want to join with Apostle Paul in saying that all this knowledge is for one reason and one reason only. As he says in 1 Corinthians 2 verse 2, for I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified.